Thank you again, Professor Yon, for the introductions. Again, my name is Victoria Heffern, and I'm here to present my thesis on the magic circle of human-robot interaction, the impact of design and context on the perception of humanoids. So going in, I would like to give some brief idea of the background and the motivation for this project. So first, we're going to talk about what is a social robot. Essentially, just a robot that has some interpersonal exchange with a human at the other end, right? Human-robot direct communication and interaction. And because of this, they should follow and adhere to societal norms and follow within our expectations that we would have for a general human-to-human, peer-to-peer interaction. Now, social robots operate in various different fields, whether it be retail. Social robots are sometimes used like in businesses. They're to like help answer questions. Healthcare, such as like telehealth or robotic nursing, as well as serving as aides in dementia care facilities as another example, and domestic when it comes to educational and autism research. There is, however, limited research into a human-centered design framework for these social robots. And this applies to both how they should act in a situation and their actual embodiment, so how they should look. The current landscape of human-robot interaction essentially takes these different factors and splits them apart and analyzes each one individually. So we have embodiment in the task, essentially viewing, okay, does the actual morphology of the robot, is it in tandem or working in tandem with what its role should be? So as an example of this, there is a common robot taxonomy that you can see here that essentially evaluates what kind of application is it, where is it working, how is it working, and how can we generally summarize its appearance. Another example is the mismatch in voice and gesture and how this kind of breaks the sense of attraction that someone can have and how engaged they will be in a conversation, as well as measuring the emotional impact of the robot as a whole. But all of these are evaluated individually and not what happens when we actually piece all of these elements together and how that overall affects the actual integration of the social robot. So our core research question is how can we prime the robot to improve human-robot interaction? So considering voice and dialogue, appearance, its movement and expressions, as well as its behavior. So the proposed approach is that by treating a robot's design and its context as a sort of entry point into a state of suspended disbelief, we can leverage immersion in these interactions in order to increase user comfort, control how the robot is going to be interpreted by that end user, improve the quality of the conversation that it is having, as well as if it's actually able to complete that task, and increasing overall engagement and interest for the human. Now, these things can feel a little bit foreign in a robotics context, but they are rather deeply explored in game design and game theory, as well as attraction and themed entertainment design, and also addressed in psychology. So we need to format a more interdisciplinary approach that can answer, for robotics in particular, what is immersion and how can we actually quantify it? This leads us into the magic circle. So the magic circle is a metaphorical boundary for the space that we enter both mentally, emotionally, as well whenever we're engaging with a game or an experience. So the magic circle essentially says that immersion is directly related to the perception and investment in an event or an activity. And inside this circle, you are transforming these mundane everyday objects kind of beyond their form and applying meaning or rules. So one example of this is imagine that I gave you a statue of a horse head. This means absolutely nothing on its own, but if you now take that same piece and say, okay, we're going to apply it to a chess game. Now, it is called a knight. It has a unique identity. It also has a particular move set that is applied to it, and everyone within the bounds of that chess game, even people who are observing it, will now all inherently agree, okay, this is a knight, and here is how it should move. We now have applied rules to it that are arbitrary. So this concept of the magic circle comes from the novel Homo Ludens, which means man at play. And this was written by a cultural theorist and a Dutch historian, Johan Huizinga, who essentially argues that all social experiences are forms of play, and therefore all extend from this magic circle idea. So whether it be a temple or a religious institution, a play or a stage, movie theaters, sports, tennis courts, all of these are closed circles that when we enter them, we all adhere to specific rules, even if it's not something we necessarily realize. So even today, we are all currently in a circle where I am acting as a presenter, you are all today acting as an audience. All this to say that human-robot interaction in itself should be viewed and can be viewed as a game. The robots are essentially role-playing in these different roles, no matter which field they are in, and they're transcending their mechanical nature to actually become a social agent. So because we're taking this highly interdisciplinary approach, we need to actually assess immersion and understand how these other fields assess it. So when it comes to video games, we can define the flow of the game, essentially how immersed are you and how engaged are you in that game, that it feels like you are absorbed inside that task. And the idea of diegesis. So with your narrative elements, essentially things, what exists inside that world. So if a robot acknowledges that it has code, it is non-diegetic. But if it says that it has thoughts, then it is diegetic. How well, essentially, is it playing a role? When it comes to elements like theme parks, we use more sensory layering to achieve something called verisimilitude, which essentially just means it felt very real or it felt very true. And using theming as well to kind of break this idea or help it all merge together much more smoothly. We also address social psychology, which has a lot more ideas of the suspension of disbelief and how they occupy a unique space where they're not necessarily alive, but still interpreted as person-like. So boiling this all down, we can actually take that same social circle, or the magic circle, and demonstrate it as it directly ties into human-robot interaction. So we can actually see this as a sort of progression. So if you are completely outside of the circle, you are not immersed in it at all, the robot is essentially just a machine. It is non-diegetic. When we are on the boundary, it is much more mixed. And finally is the full sense of immersion, or diegesis. And this has two specific categories. We go back to that idea of verisimilitude, which is essentially saying, okay, it feels very real and true to life. This is something I might see every day, versus a sense of heightened reality, which leans into more narrative and play-based imaginative features. So typically this is where we'll tend to see like children fall more into, or children's media, where it's not necessarily something you see every day, but is rather a sort of hyper-realized version of that. So we need to bring all this together and actually test. Does this magic circle of human-robot interaction work, and can it be used as a means to validate immersion as a metric? So our objective here is to test this framework across different developmental stages and interactions. So we will be doing this with both adults and children, examining each of those three positions, whether it is non-diegetic, somewhere on the boundary, or diegetic, and where adults will be exposed to things that are true to life, and children have the additional condition of a heightened reality. In this, we will be measuring immersion, so using different framed Likert scales to target the three core sections, and qualitative open responses. So for children, here's more directly what that circle looks like, where first I have the machine where it is just a robot, followed by now I have a named robot character, and finally we have Alex, who is an 8-year-old student and tries to mimic their interests. And lastly, we have Professor Bubbles, who is a scientist. Now, for all of these conditions, the robot has the same goal. So this design is meant to focus on getting children to essentially reflect on what they have learned recently in class. Moving on to adults with only those three conditions, we have again the robot, then we have the named robot character, and lastly we have Chef Hazel, who is a new chef at Morgan Dining Hall. And all of these are designed to discuss eating habits and dining preferences. and encourage curiosity about food. So breaking this down a little bit further, we can see that non-diegetic, or our machine condition, it will not have any body language and will instead use the onboard lights on both robots in order to communicate to the user. Its voice has a slight echo effect and will be slightly pitched up to mimic a more robotic sounding voice. It lacks clothes, and the pronoun usage in the way that it refers to itself and the way that I also introduce it to the participant is it, or just saying the robot. And essentially, it refers to itself in the third person, always very much letting the user know it is a robot. The transitional period, or the mixed condition, is where it now has body language, so it is actually physically capable of moving around and gesturing. Its voice is the normal base voice of the robot. It lacks clothes, but its pronoun use can be both it or she or he. And the prompt directly has its name. It's a much more colloquial-based greeting, right? Hello, my name is, but I am a robot. Here is the task we are going to do. And lastly, diegetic, where it is basically in that full role, whether it be a student, a chef, or a scientist. Normal voice, body language, we have added the addition of clothes to help cement the idea of a role, and a much more naturalistic prompt. This condition order is also randomized during testing, so the order doesn't influence the data. Now, in order to actually assess where people are and what they feel of the robot, we have split this into some different core question categories. The first one being the design, so how the design actually facilitated the integration of that circle and how much their suspension of disbelief was there. So an example question an adult might receive is, did the robot's voice, movements, and appearance, were they cohesive? Because we're also working with children, we want to make sure that they're still able to answer a similar question accurately and at their level. So the adaptation of this would be, did the robot's voice, moves, and looks all fit together? The next category is anthropomorphism. So that's the degree to which we project human traits onto a non-human object. So a sample question here would be, I felt that I had an influence on the robot's responses. For children, did it pay attention? Trust and comfort. So what would be the risk or lack thereof if we were to actually deploy this robot, and whether or not people felt okay with actually talking to it. And there was also a sort of open free response section here for comments. So we worked with the internal review board to actually finalize these surveys. So on the left here, you can see how this was actually formatted for children, so everything is at their level. And instead of using abstract numbers, instead we use a 5-point smiley face Likert scale, so they're able to actually select which emotion they feel corresponds the most to what they, or how they actually felt about the situation. Was also framed as a sort of like detective investigation. And for adults, this was just a survey hosted on Qualtrics with a 7-point Likert scale. Moving on to the actual results of this testing. So first, we're going to go over how the testing went with children. So we had 10 total participants that were from the age range of 8 to 12 years old. And we worked with the Worcester Boys and Girls Club for this. So every child had a one-on-one interaction that was observed by other students in the room. Each session operated under a different condition, one of those 4, and each condition was observed twice. We also removed the robot from the room at the end of each condition when the children filled out the survey. And with this, we also told them that each interaction was with a different robot each time. So the first category of assessment is the general design. So we can see here, was the robot fun? Did it voice, moves, and looks all fit together? Did it feel like a friend? Did it act like a real person? Did it make the conversation fun? With this, we can see that the robot was the least inherently fun for them to interact with. The student was the most friendly and cohesive overall, and also the most realistic for them. But the scientists did do a better job at making the school reflection part a lot more engaging. When it comes to anthropomorphization, we can see that the student character had the most human-like traits overall. We saw that it responded well, it seemed like it knew what it was doing, and it moved in a much more smooth and naturalistic way. But we also see that the scientist character was actually interpreted as the most smart of the group. And generally speaking, the mixed or on the boundary condition had a very poor sense of self or independence. When it comes to trusting the robot, the student and the scientist were the most highly trusted overall. Um, they tend to feel like it did things or that made them much more comfortable. They would want to use it again. And as we see, the more immersion or the more immersed they are in the activity, it actually makes it easier to understand and also become more surprising for them. So here we can see the total average scores across all of the questions. So the student was the clear favorite out of all of them. One of the students was quoted as saying, "It seemed the most human." They very much enjoyed like its clothes. It had a greater sense of relatability to them, which made it more human because they had shared interests. So a very small subset of the children, so about 2 out of 10, actually preferred the completely robotic case. And we can see based on the data that while the scientist was very immersive, it was too teacher-like for them to actually enjoy it in an after-school setting, and it wasn't necessarily the most relatable to them. But at the end, 9 out of the 10 children did actually believe that every condition was a completely different robot. Moving on to the adult portion of our study, we had 29 total participants. So the first 2 days we had 11 each, and the last day was 7. We were able to test ages 18 through 25. This was a one-on-one public interaction. So they were directly seated in front of the robot, having a conversation with it, and anyone who happened to pass by can essentially observe the interaction. Now, this was done for 3 days total, so each day was essentially the robot acting under a different condition. One day would be the chef, one day would be mixed, one day would be completely robotic. Similarly here, we can go back to, again, our design assessments. So how engaged were you in the task? Did you forget that it was an object during the interaction? How consistent was it? So here we can see that the actions are relatively consistent overall, but the chef was the most engaging and the easiest to forget that it was a robot. And we again see that the mixed condition is a little bit harder for people to read, mostly when it comes to its cohesiveness and that the environment actually helped the robot. It seemed like it didn't belong. When it comes to anthropomorphization, the movements were generally perceived to be the same throughout, but the chef had the most independence and capability during the interactions. People could actually influence, or they felt that they could actually influence the conversation more, and that it was a successful conversation. Then we come to trust. So generally the chef made people feel more comfortable. One thing that we did for adults that we were not able to do with children is we actually timed the conversation. So everyone was told that there was a 5-minute time limit, but if they felt bored or uncomfortable, they could end the interaction early. So looking at the graph on the left here, we can see the average conversation time relatively similar, but does go up the more immersed we get. However, when we come to the actual quality of the engagement, which is going to assess, did it stay on task and talk to people about food? The quality of the engagement essentially ramps up as we are more immersed in the chef character. Now, we have the conversation breakdown. So this is looking at the quality of the engagement, but what makes up that remaining time when it wasn't talking about food? Was it a positive engagement or negative engagement? Here, we classify positive as it was generally cooperating on both ends, and the interaction was able to progress in some way. And then we have the negative side. So it was essentially stalled, a lot of repetition, or things were rather misaligned. So it's here, most of the remaining time for the chef was positive engagement, and most of the robotic one was negative. So as an example of a negative interaction, this is an actual exchange that occurred. So someone here was talking about a spot on campus that they like to eat at. However, they tried asking the robot some questions, and it would essentially keep redirecting. Right? Please keep the focus on dining options. We're going to go back to this topic. And again, the user tried pushing a little bit more. I feel like this should be a give and take type deal. I want to see your capabilities before you learn more about me. And how does the robot respond to that? Here is what I am designed to do. Please share more about that. An example of a positive interaction. So here we can see our chef character mentioning the campus center has great food options. Do you have a favorite place to go? And the person specifically asks, well, they're a chef. What specifically do you make at Morgan Hall? And it's able to answer while also integrating more about what options exist at that dining hall. So pizzas, stir fries, salads, and soups, and kind of smoothly redirects the conversation back to what types of food are you curious about? So as a general overview, here again, we can see the total average scores across that 7-point Likert scale. And the chef, again, the more immersive condition was perceived as the best. So generally across all of those questions that we saw, it performed better, even if by a small margin for all of those three categories. Here are also some direct comments from each testing condition where the machine, it comes off as a lot more creepy to the human on the other end of the interaction. I couldn't contribute to conversations. It reminded me of talking to an answering machine. And one point that I found interesting is anytime it did like a sort of idle animation, they thought it came off as aggressive. Moving over to mixed, they understood its more embodied nature, but it felt very rudimentary. It was like a prototype, it was inefficient, and someone actually noted that they realized they weren't able to ask anything. They only existed there to answer the questions. But when it came to our full immersive case, they say, well, it helped me decide what I should eat. It was attentive, it was appropriate, it was fun, it was a good conversation, and I would actually come back to it if I needed help trying to decide what I should actually eat that day. So, as a summary, we were able to successfully take this magic circle framework and actually apply it to human-robot interaction. We were able to actually validate this through all of those testing with both children and adults to observe the differences there. So immersion essentially helps highlight the interaction. It makes it a lot more better for both the robot and the user itself, as the robot can accomplish its task much more efficiently, and the end user is much more comfortable as well. So some next steps and future work. A lot of the data here was a very small sample size. We are still trying to go through and conduct more testing, both like at the Boys and Girls Club and here on campus. So there was another condition as well where we wanted to, instead of just the chef, we also wanted to test immersion as a personal trainer in the gym with Pepper. So we're currently in talks with the rec center here for that. This larger participant sample size would also allow us to perform a statistical significance analysis. So with this higher pool, we can actually factor in, okay, was there any sampling error or differences simply just due to chance? We can also take a closer examination at which ones matter most, right? Does the costume matter the most? Is it the voice? And kind of take apart the pieces so we know which one has a higher priority in terms of overall immersion. And testing for different fields. Lastly, I would like to just take some acknowledgements. So I would like to thank everyone who made this research possible. So the Boys and Girls Club of Worcester, of course, for hosting our visits and letting us do STEM outreach. The events office and the dining hall staff for logistics, their flexibility with timing, and they also assisted us to make sure that there was a mindful attempt when discussing food. I'd also like to thank Kate Stoller, as she helped me actually run the experiments at the Boys and Girls Club, as well as my classmates and all of my friends that are here for actually helping me run pilot tests and giving critical feedback, as well as my family for their unwavering belief and support, as well as my thesis committee, so Professor Yuan, my advisor, Professor Lee, and Professor Otmar. And thank you all of you for your time, and if you have any questions, I am happy to answer them.
Any questions from the audience?
Yeah.
I'm a little curious about how you decided on what clothes specifically to put on the robots for the student, because personally, I feel like what you put on the robot makes a massive difference. So
yeah. Those clothes were actually like one of my younger cousins. So I feel like it was the most true into what an actual child would wear. There were old clothes that he does not fit into anymore. And actually, because of that, like some of the children noted specifically, like, oh, I really like Pokemon. He has a Pokemon shirt on, and they would kind of bring that into the conversation. So it definitely has a high impact on what the end result is. The chef one and the scientist, I think, were a little more direct, right? There is a specific uniform essentially that chefs have to wear. And the scientist, because it was a more heightened reality one, we can go for just a more like costumed look rather than an actual scientist outfit. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting how you had mentioned how the children, at least the majority of them, were kind of surprised to realize that um, each robot was actually the same robot because they had been introduced as different, like entire entities.
Yeah.
Uh, do you take any significance from that in terms of just like reflecting on the data?
I think it kind of goes to show, right? Because if I take each one and it's viewed as completely separate, it's acting as a completely different agent, essentially, right? Like there is a separation in my mind of these can't possibly be the same just because they're acting and looking different, especially in that case. Adults, I think it would be a little easier for them to see through that, but it kind of cements their like just how much the role that immersion plays in that interaction. So the more immersed I am, it's a lot easier to see, okay, this has completely separate attributes. And because of that, I can separate it out in my mind, right? Like this is existing in the circle versus outside of that circle. Yeah.
I know on seeing your results, I was kind of surprised to see that the
Yes.
transitional, that the transitional robot was more poorly received than either the character or the robot. Do you have any ideas on why that might be?
That is something one I would want to look into further, but based on kind of like all of like that literature review, it kind of comes from a notion of that transitional period. It feels like it can't commit to an idea. It's hard to get a sense of self when I'm not sure, is this supposed to be a machine or is it supposed to be a character, someone I'm like a social agent or acting as someone. So it kind of exists in this weird boundary where I either want to be fully immersed or not at all. Because where does it fall if it is in the middle? It comes across as more off-putting, that it doesn't have a concrete identity.
Thank you.
Any other question?
Maybe slightly outside the scope, but I feel like I've been seeing a lot of robotics going in the direction of people actually controlling the robots and kind of putting on like a character or actor persona for them. I'm curious if you think that would be similarly well received as just putting a robot and programming it versus like putting a character behind it and having
Yeah.
a character there for them.
I feel like that in that sense, it functions almost as like an extension of like improv theater almost, right? You are essentially doing a performance. I think having a human who is a little bit more flexible and able to understand the role makes that easier in sense of like teleoperated robots in that case. But I think generally the idea is the more immersed it will be, we should probably still expect to see a similar trend.
So similarly, like I understand this might be again outside the scope of the study here, but I understand that when it comes to interacting with people, there's a lot of like subtle nuances and like mannerisms, tone of voice, like sarcasm, etc., that we can pick up, but the robot not be able to. I believe
Yes.
again the robot. It's a lot easier to have the robot just take the person at their word. Is there some cues that you think in a future work would be fairly easy to start implementing in terms of a sort of social perception on the robot agent?
Yeah, definitely. So, like you mentioned right now, it is essentially the robot is just getting like whatever the person said at face value, essentially just as a large piece of text. So, I think adding sentiment analysis to that, both in being able to like use a camera or one of the onboard cameras to actually assess what does the person look like, what are they actually expressing, and then also tonally in their voice as well. One thing that also did come up because a lot of its motions were mostly just contextual based on what it was saying, and it was a conversation that they were trying to have. Despite that, many of the participants wanted to like shake the chef's hand at the end of the interaction or get it to wave. And there was not currently like any architecture that would allow that like direct physical communication to happen. So adding that layer on top of it would also definitely be something to address and will impact the experience.
I guess on a similar note, do you think it would be worth it for a future work to explore different algorithms that are used to program the robot and how those interact as opposed to others?
Yeah, so right now, again, with like each persona is essentially saying, okay, this is a chef, here are like your interests, here is this. I think making that more dynamic, definitely. And like you mentioned, going through what are different ways we can control the motion, not only saying having it contextual or just affirming, like giving a nod after someone is done talking, making that more dynamic and opening it up to let's also consider, right, is the person trying to shake its hand or looking at a certain aspect and making it feel a little bit more lived in as an approach.
Okay, I have a general question. So you design for robot characters there. So suppose we are going to use a now robot for teaching the case. Which character are you going to use to teach the case?
I think because the role there will be slightly different. If it's trying to act as a teacher, it is likely that the more teacher-like persona should come into play. Here, because we were at the Boys and Girls Club, it was much more of an after-school setting, which is likely why they preferred Alex in that conversation or the student character in that conversation. So that again ties into what role is it trying to do, and then what social role typically fills there.
Do you think the Alex role can maybe, do a better job in long-term engage the students?
Yeah, that one was, or like the student Alex condition was mostly focused on like reflective activities. So a lot of the times, like the children would bring up their interest with it because it does look like a peer and it will talk about like Pokemon and recess, but it will use that as a way to tie it back in. So like incorporating math concepts based on the interests that they presented. So that high engagement is probably better for long term.
All right, any other question? If not, we will ask the audience to step outside so that we can have some community, have some closed door